The rain had not stopped for 3 days. Elena stood at the edge of the auction pen with her boots sinking slowly into the mud, her collar pulled up against the wind, and her eyes fixed on something no one else in that crowd had bothered to look at twice. The auctioneer's voice was moving fast, rattling off numbers like a man who wanted to go home. Beside the pen, a young horse stood with his head dropped so low it nearly touched the ground. His legs trembled with the effort of holding himself upright. Someone behind her laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and said quietly that the animal should have been put down at birth. Elena did not move. She did not look away. And in that moment, something shifted inside her, something she had not felt since the morning she buried her husband. A pull so deep and certain it frightened her a little. She raised her hand. Before we go any further, there is something you need to know about this story. What you are about to hear is not about a horse. Not really. It is about what happens when the world tells you that something is finished, that it is broken beyond repair, that its best days never came and never will. And one person decides, quietly, to disagree. If you have ever been told you were too slow, too soft, or too late, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Because the moment this Colt finally lifted his head, the moment the rain came down and every single person on that ranch fell silent, it will hit you in a place you did not expect. Leave your city in the comments below. And if you believe that patience is its own kind of courage, press like before we begin. Now let us go back to Montana. Let us go back to the rain, to the mud, and to a woman who raised her hand when everyone else had already turned away. Whistling Pines Ranch sat at the base of a long valley in western Montana, where the mountains did not announce themselves gently. They rose without apology, dark and blunt, and the sky above them was almost always the color of pewter in the early morning. The wind came down through the pines in long, low waves, and on still nights you could hear it moving through the fence posts like something trying to find a way in. The ranch had a history that the land itself seemed to remember. For 40 years, it had been one of the few working rehabilitation ranches in the region, a place where draft horses and heavy breeds came when they were lame, when they were scared, when they had been mishandled or pushed too hard by owners who measured value in output alone. Emmett Birch had built the place with his father's lumber money and his own 2 hands, and he had run it with a patience and instinct that made other ranchers quietly jealous, even as they shook their head at the sentimentality of it all. He had a gift. That was the word people used when they did not want to say they admired something they did not fully understand. Emmett died on a Tuesday morning in October, 14 months before this story begins. He was in the south pasture, fixing a section of fence the way he always did, alone, without telling anyone, because he never wanted help with the small things. The coroner said his heart had simply stopped. Clean and instant, she said, as if that were a mercy. Elena had stood in the hallway of their house for a long time after hearing those words, trying to decide whether she agreed. She did not think she did. In the months that followed, the ranch became something she carried rather than something she ran. She kept the animals fed. She kept the stalls clean. She paid the hands what she could and said nothing when 2 of them left for steadier work in early spring. She answered every letter from the County Agricultural Society with the same careful handwriting Emmett had taught her to use for official correspondence. Precise, unhurried, giving nothing away. She attended the regional meetings and sat in the back row and said little, because she had learned quickly that the men in those rooms had already decided what kind of widow she was going to be. The kind that sold. It was not a cruel assumption. It was, to most of them, simply practical. The Whistling Pines operation required a specific kind of authority, not brute strength, they were careful to say, but presence, command. A rancher's instinct that they all agreed Emmett had possessed from birth and which, in their estimation, could not be inherited by a woman who had spent most of her married life keeping the books, tending the kitchen garden, and accompanying her husband to shows where she stood slightly behind him and smiled at the right moments. What they did not know, what Elena had not yet fully understood about herself, was that she had been watching. For 23 years, she had been watching everything. She woke at 5 every morning now, the way she always had, but the silence of the house was different without Emmett's breathing in the next room. She dressed in the dark, drank her coffee standing at the kitchen window, and watched the mist come down through the pines. The ranch looked different in that light, older, smaller, more fragile than she remembered it being. The east fence needed painting. The drainage on the north side of the barn had been silting up for 2 seasons, and Emmett had kept saying he would get to it. She had started a list. The list was long. The money was not. Emmett had kept the ranch solvent through his reputation and through years of careful management, but he had never been a man who accumulated. What he earned went back into the land and the animals, and what remained was a modest account and a more modest savings that Elena now drew from with the deliberateness of someone who knows exactly how deep the well is. She had not told anyone how shallow it had become. Kendall Birch, Emmett's younger brother, a man who had the same angular face as his brother, but none of the same stillness behind the eyes, had come to the house in December with a folder of papers and the kind of careful sympathy that made Elena want to close the door before he finished his sentence. He had a proposal, he said. A developer from Billings had been making inquiries about the valley. Not a strip of it, not a corner, the whole sweep from the tree line to the creek, including the ranch and the grazing rights that went with it. The number he named was real. She could see that in his face, in the slight forward lean of his body when he said it. He owned 40% of the land outright, a legacy of the original family division that Emmett had always intended to resolve and never quite had. Without Elena's agreement, he could not sell. But with a certain legal mechanism, a clause in the original deed that neither she nor most county attorneys had ever had reason to read carefully. If the ranch failed to meet the annual productivity standards of the County Agricultural Association for 2 consecutive years, his minority stake would convert to a blocking right, and a 3-judge panel could compel sale. She had listened to all of this without speaking. When he was finished, she thanked him for coming and showed him to the door. That night, she sat at Emmett's desk and read every word of the original deed by lamplight. She read it twice. Then she put it in the top drawer, closed it carefully, and went to bed. She did not sleep. The spring clearance auction at the Garfield County Fairgrounds was not the kind of event that made it into the regional papers. It was a working auction, practical, unsentimental, attended by ranchers who came with specific needs and left with specific animals. Draft horses, work mules, the occasional retired quarter horse that had been reclassified from performance stock to pasture companion. And sometimes, at the end of the day when the good lots had already gone and the crowd was thinning out, the animals nobody wanted. Elena arrived early, as she always had when she came with Emmett. She walked the pens alone this time, without a clipboard, without a budget sheet, without a clear plan. She had told herself she was looking for a young draft horse, something with strong legs and decent conformation that she could rehabilitate and sell at a profit, or at least show at the annual inspection as evidence that the Whistling Pines program was still producing. That was the practical reason. The real reason, the one she had not quite put into words, was that she needed to come back here. She needed to stand in the smell of hay and wet earth and animal warmth and feel like herself again. She walked the length of the first pen without stopping. The horses there were solid and loud. They stamped and tossed their heads and pushed against the rails in the way that healthy, slightly bored animals do. She paused at a gray Belgian mare with good hip angles and noted her number. She moved on. The second pen was quieter. There were 4 animals in it. 3 of them stood in a cluster at the far end, heads up, watching her with the alert nervousness of horses that have been moved too recently and have not yet decided whether to be calm. The 4th stood alone near the gate, close enough that she could see the individual hairs on his muzzle trembling in the cold air. He was a colt, young, perhaps 18 months, though malnutrition made it difficult to be certain. His coat was a dark bay, dulled by poor condition to something closer to the color of wet ash. His ribs were not visible, but only just. His legs, and this was what stopped her, his legs stood at angles that were wrong in a way she could not immediately name. Not broken, not deformed, but compressed, somehow, as if the joints had been locked into position by something that had nothing to do with bone. His head was down, not grazing. There was no grass to graze. Just down, in the way of an animal that has learned that holding its head up costs more than it gains. She stopped in front of him and said nothing for a long moment. He did not look at her. She reached slowly through the rail and touched the flat of her hand to his neck. He flinched, a full-body tremor that ran from his shoulder to his haunches, and then went still again. He did not move away. She stayed there for several minutes, her hand resting against his neck, feeling the warmth of him through the cold. An auction hand came by, glanced at the colt, and shook his head with the practiced candor of someone who has learned that honesty is more efficient than diplomacy in these settings. That one, he said, is a processing lot. Buyer from Kalispell already put a hold on him. He will be picked up Thursday if nobody bids. Elena understood what processing meant. She had understood it for years in the abstract, and now, with her hand against the neck of this animal, she understood it in the particular. She asked what the minimum bid was. The hand told her. It was low enough to embarrass her for a different reason, not because she could not afford it, but because it told her exactly what the Colt was worth to every other person who had walked past this pen today. She went back inside. She sat through 4 lots she had intended to bid on and did not raise her hand for any of them. She thought about the Belgian mare with the good hip angles. She thought about the inspection in 6 months, about Kendall's folder of papers, about the list of things the ranch needed that she could not afford to fix all at once. She thought about her hand against the Colt's neck, the way he had gone still. When Lot 47 was called and the auctioneer described it with the flat efficiency of a man who expected no real competition, Elena raised her paddle. There were 2 other bids, both, she suspected, from people who had not looked closely at the animal and were simply testing the floor. She outbid them both without drama, and when the gavel came down, she felt something she had not felt in 14 months. Not happiness exactly, something quieter than that, something that felt, for the first time, like direction. She named him that evening, standing in the stall she had cleared and bedded with fresh straw. She said the name aloud, to see how it felt in the cold barn air. Beacon, she said. He did not lift his head, but one ear turned toward her, slowly, the way ears do when something registers even if the body is too tired to respond. She took that as enough. The first week with Beacon was an education in the difference between what she had expected and what was actually true. She had expected an animal that was simply underfed, and there was truth in that. She adjusted his feed carefully, conscious of the dangers of refeeding too aggressively, and she brought in good hay from the winter stores she had been rationing for her other horses. He ate. That was a beginning. But the legs were not improving with nutrition alone, and the more she watched him move, the short, stilted steps, the way he placed each hoof with an excessive care that was not caution but compensation, the more she understood that the problem was not one she could solve with feed and rest. She called Dr. Vera Osman, the large animal vet who had worked with Emmett for the last decade, and who came out from Missoula when the situation warranted a drive. Vera arrived on a gray morning with the no-nonsense energy of a woman who has spent 30 years refusing to be surprised by what people do to animals, and spent 20 minutes in the stall with Beacon before she spoke. What she said changed everything Elena thought she understood about the Colt. The legs were not defective by birth, Vera explained. She had expected to find evidence of angular limb deformity, a structural issue that would have been present from foaling and that no amount of care could fully reverse. Instead, what she found in the tendons and the flexor muscles was the signature of something else entirely: prolonged confinement in a space too small to allow natural movement, beginning at an age when the musculoskeletal system was still forming itself around the demands it encountered. Someone had kept this animal, for months, she estimated, in a stall so small he could barely turn around. In those conditions, the body adapts. The tendons shorten. The muscles contract around the restricted range of motion and begin to treat that restriction as normal. By the time the confinement ends, the animal walks as if it is still inside the small space, because in a neurological sense it still is. It is not permanent, Vera said carefully, but it requires patience and a specific kind of physical therapy: gentle stretching, progressive movement, groundwork that coaxes the tendons back toward their natural length without forcing them and causing tearing. Weeks, possibly months. And there was a complication, she added, watching Elena's face as she said it. The trauma of confinement often leaves a behavioral imprint that outlasts the physical damage. The animal may resist movement. It may refuse spaces it associates with vulnerability. It may seem, at times, to improve and then retreat without apparent reason. What you have here, Vera said, is not a broken horse, but it is a frightened one. And frightened horses heal on their own schedule, not yours. Elena nodded. She was standing at the stall door, her arms folded, her face still. What she was thinking, and did not say, was that she recognized exactly what Vera was describing. Not in the Colt. In herself. She had spent the past 14 months moving in a compressed range, managing what needed managing, answering what needed answering, occupying the minimum necessary space. She had not wept at the funeral, not because she felt nothing, but because she was not sure that if she started she would stop, and there had been too many people watching, and Emmett had always said she had a gift for holding things together. She had held things together. She had become very good at the small space. She started the therapy sessions the next morning, twice a day, before the other animals were fed and after the evening checks. She went into the stall with Beacon and worked his legs through slow, careful flexion exercises that Vera had demonstrated. She did not rush. She watched his breathing. When he tensed, she stopped. When he relaxed, she continued. She spoke to him in the low, even voice she used for difficult conversations. Not cheerful, not performative, just present. At the end of the first week, he took 3 steps without the stilted compensation pattern. At the end of the second week, he walked to the water trough on his own without stopping halfway to reconsider. On the morning of the 18th day, she opened the stall door to the outside run and stood back and waited. He stood at the threshold for a long time, longer than felt comfortable, long enough that she began to wonder if Vera had been wrong about the permanence. Then he stepped out, one step, then another, into the weak February light, onto the half-frozen ground. He stood there with his head still low, but his ears were forward now, reading the morning. Elena pressed her hand flat against her sternum, because something had happened in her chest that she did not have a word for yet. She did not know, could not have known standing there in the February cold, that what she was watching was not just a horse learning to walk. She was watching the beginning of something that would cost her more than she was prepared to give, and return more than she had ever thought to ask for. March came with the specific cruelty of Montana springs, warm enough to encourage hope, cold enough to punish it. The snowmelt filled the creek and softened the ground into the particular mud that swallowed fence posts and made every task take twice as long. Elena worked through it without complaint. Because complaining required energy, she had redirected. Beacon's progress was real, but it was not linear, and it was not predictable, and both of those things were harder than she had anticipated. There were days when he moved with an ease that made her stand at the fence and simply watch, the way you watch something beautiful that you know is fragile. His dark bay coat had begun to recover its depth with proper nutrition, and when the light caught him at the right angle in the late afternoon, she could see the structure beneath the surface, the length of his neck, the slope of his shoulder, the proportions of an animal that was not, had never been, what he had looked like in that auction pen. There was architecture there that she had sensed without being able to name it. And then there were days when he retreated. The retreats came without clear warning. He would be moving well, responding to the groundwork she had built up slowly over weeks, the long lining, the gentle flexion on the lead rope, and then something would shift, a sound from beyond the tree line, a change in the light, a gust that moved through the barn in a particular way. And he would stop, not shy, not bold, just stop, compress, fold back into himself like something closing. Those were the days that tested her in ways the practical problems did not. She could fix a fence. She could manage the feed budget and negotiate with suppliers and answer Kendall's letters with the same careful handwriting and the same absence of visible fear. But she could not accelerate the interior process of an animal that had learned, at a cellular level, that the world was not reliably safe. She could only be there, consistently, without agenda, until being there became more familiar than being afraid. Kendall came to the ranch in the middle of March. He did not call ahead. He drove up the gravel road in his clean truck and parked in the yard and walked to the fence where Elena was working with Beacon on the lead line. He stood there for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching. He was not a cruel man, she had decided. He was a man who had made a calculation and was committed to it, and who experienced the fact of her continued presence on the ranch not as an affront, but as an inconvenience that reason should eventually resolve. He told her he had spoken with the inspection committee. He told her he understood there was a new animal, a young horse she had acquired at the clearance auction. He said this without judgment, but the absence of judgment was itself a kind of judgment. He asked how the rehabilitation program was proceeding. She told him it was proceeding. He nodded slowly, looking at Beacon. The Colt stood at the far end of the lead, head still not quite at the height it should be, legs not quite as square as she wanted. She could see Kendall running the numbers, the inspection standards, the timeline, the visible state of the animal in front of him, and arriving at a conclusion she recognized. He said, "Elena, the inspection is in 6 months. They will be looking at conformation, movement quality, temperament. They will be looking at whether this operation still produces animals that meet the association standards. I am not saying this to be unkind. I am saying it because I think you need to hear it from someone." She kept her eyes on Beacon. She said, I hear you, Kendall. He stood there a moment longer. Then he said, if you need help, financial help, a bridge until you make a decision about the property, the offer I described in December is still open. The developer is patient. He understands that these things take time. She said, thank you for coming. After he left, she stood in the field for a long time. The wind came down through the pines, and Beacon shifted beside her, and she thought about what patient meant to a man with a folder of papers and a developer's number in his phone. She thought about what patient meant standing here in the mud with a frightened horse on a lead line. She decided they were not the same word. In April, she hired a part-time hand named Dex, a young man barely 20, son of a family she had known through the association for years, who worked with the focused quietness of someone for whom silence was not awkward but natural. He had no formal training, but he had grown up around horses the way some children grow up around music, absorbing it before language, in the body rather than the mind. He watched how she worked with Beacon and asked few questions, and the questions he asked were the right ones. Together, they built a routine. It was not dramatic. It was repetitive, patient, day after day of the same sequence: movement, rest, contact, release, with small variations introduced slowly enough that they did not register as change until the change had already been absorbed. By the end of April, Beacon was walking in collected, even strides. Not the stride of a competition horse. Not yet, but the stride of an animal that was beginning to inhabit its own body instead of moving around the memory of confinement. One evening, Dex came to find her in the barn. He said, quietly, he follows you now. When you walk away, he watches where you go. She said, I know. Dex nodded. After a pause, he said, that means something. She said, I know that too. But that same week, the first storm came in from the north, and everything changed. The storm arrived on a Thursday night without much warning. A shift in the wind around sundown, a particular smell in the air that Elena had learned over 23 years meant something real was coming. And then, after midnight, the sound of it. Not rain first. Thunder. She heard it from bed, a low, distant percussion that rolled across the valley and hit the mountains and came back as something larger. She lay still for a moment listening. Then she heard Beacon. Not a whinny. Not the sharp, alarmed call of a frightened horse. Something lower and more sustained. A sound she did not have a name for because she had not heard it before. A sound that did not ask for anything. It simply was. She dressed and went to the barn. He was in the corner of the stall, pressed against the wall in the particular way she had not seen him do since the earliest days after the auction. His eyes were white-rimmed. His breathing was shallow and fast. Every time the thunder moved through, his whole body shook with a tremor that started in his chest and ran to his quarters. She stood at the stall door. She did not go in immediately. She watched him, trying to understand what she was seeing. He was not physically in danger. The barn was solid. The stall was safe. The storm, loud as it was outside. What was happening to Beacon was not a response to present danger. It was a response to a sound that his body had cataloged as catastrophic, for reasons she could not know. She thought about what Vera had said. The trauma leaves a behavioral imprint that outlasts the physical damage. She thought about the stall that had been too small and the months inside it, and what sounds might have come from outside a small dark space during a long Montana winter while the tendons shortened and the world contracted to the width of four walls. She went in. She sat down in the straw in the corner, not beside him, not yet, but in the corner of the stall where he could see her, and she waited. The thunder came again, heavier this time, and he shook, and she did not move, and she did not speak. She simply sat. After a while, she did not track the time. He turned his head and looked at her, not with the wide, frightened eye, but with something more complicated. Something that was still afraid, but was also registering that she was there, and was still there, and was not moving away. She began to hum. Not consciously, not as a strategy. It came from somewhere further back than strategy. It was a melody Emmett had used to hum while he worked, something he claimed came from his father, who had claimed it came from his. A melody without words, minor-keyed and unhurried. The kind of tune that does not demand anything from the listener. The kind of tune that fills silence without crowding it. The thunder continued. The rain came down. She sat in the straw and hummed. At some point, Beacon moved. Slowly, with the careful deliberateness that was still his default mode, he crossed the stall and stood beside her. He did not lower his head to her. He simply stood, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against her shoulder through the barn air. She kept humming. The storm went on for 2 hours. When it passed, and the rain softened, and the air inside the barn began to settle, she became aware of something she had not allowed herself to feel since the night Emmett died. She was not managing. She was not holding herself together for the benefit of some watching audience. She was simply here, in the straw, in the dark, with an animal that had also been broken by confinement and had also been trying, in its own way, to find the length of its own stride again. She stayed until morning. In the days that followed, she began to understand that the storm fear was not a problem she could solve with technique. It was not a behavioral puzzle with a practical solution. It was the deepest part of what had been done to Beacon, the part that the physical therapy had not and could not reach. The legs could be lengthened. The stride could be restored. But the place inside him that lit up with existential terror at the sound of distant thunder, that was something else. And she was running out of time. The County Agricultural Society held its May meeting at the community hall in Garfield, and Elena attended. She had attended every meeting since Emmett died, but this one was different. The annual inspection calendar had been formally posted, and the date, mid-September, a Thursday, was now official. There would be 3 evaluators on the panel, as always. There would be a public morning session where owners could bring animals for preliminary review and receive informal feedback before the actual inspection, scheduled for late August. That preliminary session was important. It was not binding, but it was the moment at which the committee formed its first impression, and in a region where impressions were durable things, it mattered more than the formal wording of the charter suggested. Elena sat in her usual seat at the back and listened to the agenda items with the focused attention of someone who has learned to hear what is not being said alongside what is. There were 4 other ranchers who would be presenting animals for the draft and heavy breed category. She knew all of them by name and reputation. 2 had strong operations, consistent producers with established relationships on the committee. 1 was in the same position she was, running a smaller outfit on a tighter margin, though his margin was, she suspected, wider than hers. The 4th was Harlan Goss, who ran the largest working draft operation in the county and who had never, in the 12 years Elena had been attending these meetings, failed to express an opinion on the direction of the association standards. He believed in size, in immediate visual power, in the kind of animal that made an impression from 40 feet away. After the formal agenda, during the open discussion period, Harlan mentioned, without naming her, that he hoped the committee would hold the line on conformation standards this year. There had been, he said carefully, some concern in the community about the direction of certain operations in the valley. Concern that the spirit of the association's program, which was, he said, to maintain and promote the highest quality of working and heritage breeds in the state, might be diluted by well-intentioned but ultimately counterproductive efforts to rehabilitate animals whose productive future was uncertain. No one looked at Elena. That was how she knew he was talking about her. The committee chair, a man named Gerald Pauck, who had been running these meetings since before Emmett bought the ranch, said that the standards were clear and would be applied consistently to all participants. His tone was neutral. She could not read whether that neutrality was protective or simply procedural. On the way out, a woman named Clara Briggs, who ran a small horse rescue operation 2 valleys over and had been an ally of Emmett's in several association debates over the years, fell into step beside her in the parking lot. Clara said, without preamble, Harlan talked to Kendall last week. I thought you should know that. Elena said, I assumed. Clara said, they are going to watch you closely in August. If the preliminary session goes badly, Kendall has the legal mechanism to request an accelerated review of the deed clause. He has apparently already spoken with an attorney in Billings. Elena said, I know about the clause. Clara looked at her. She said, what is the horse like? Elena thought about the question for a moment. The real answer, not the safe one. She said, he is beginning to trust the ground under him. Clara nodded slowly. She said, and the storm fear? Word gets around, Elena. People talk. Elena said, I know they do. Clara stopped at her truck. She looked at Elena with the directness of a woman who has spent years making decisions in situations where there was no comfortable option. She said, you could use the traditional correction methods. 2 weeks of systematic desensitization with pressure cues. It is not gentle, but it works faster, and by August he would walk out in a thunderstorm without blinking. Plenty of good horsemen have done it. Elena did not answer immediately. The question sat between them in the evening air, and Clara let it sit there without filling the space, because she was wise enough to know that some things need room. Finally, Elena said, "Emmett never used those methods." Clara said, "Emmett is gone, Elena." She said it with gentleness, but without softening it, because there was no kind way to say true things, and Clara had long since stopped trying to find one. Elena drove home in the last of the evening light, through the valley where the mountains were going dark at their edges and the pines were moving in the wind off the ridge. She thought about pressure and about patience. She thought about the difference between an animal that has been made compliant and an animal that has chosen to trust. She thought about what it would cost her to know, for the rest of her life, which one she had produced. She turned onto the gravel road and saw the light in the barn, Dex doing the evening check, and she sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off, listening to the pines. She had an answer. She was not certain it was the right one, but it was the only one she could make without becoming someone she did not recognize. June was the hardest month. It was not hard in the way that February had been hard. The blunt, physical hardship of cold mornings and compressed finances and the sheer weight of managing alone. June was hard in the quiet the way that doubt is hard when it comes from inside instead of outside, when you cannot resolve it by working harder or staying longer or being more disciplined. The storm fear did not improve on its own timetable. She had hoped, with the approach of summer and the longer days and the gradual accumulation of trust, that the thunderstorm response would soften, and it had, slightly. He no longer pressed himself against the wall with the same desperation of the early weeks. But when the storms came in off the mountains in the long summer evenings, the shaking was still there, and the white rim of the eye was still there, and no amount of progress in his daily movement and groundwork seemed to touch that particular place in him. She continued to sit with him during the storms. Every time. She did not count the hours. She brought a blanket after the first time she woke up stiff and cold at 4 in the morning, and she brought a small lamp that gave off just enough light to see his breathing, and she sat in the corner of the stall and hummed the melody that had no name and waited for the thunder to pass. Dex knew she was doing it. He did not comment. He arrived each morning to find her in the barn already, sometimes with straw still in her hair, and he went about the morning work without making her awareness of his awareness into something uncomfortable. She was grateful for that more than she told him. In the second week of June, she drove to Missoula to talk to Vera again. Not a farm call, a conversation, in the small office behind Vera's clinic where the walls were covered in the annotated anatomy charts that Vera used for teaching. She sat across the desk from the vet and told her everything. The progress and the setbacks, the storm sessions, the preliminary inspection in August, and what it would mean if Beacon could not perform. Vera listened without interrupting, which was one of her best qualities. When Elena was finished, Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to tell you something about this kind of trauma that I did not fully explain when I was at the ranch in February. The reason the storm fear is separated from the physical improvement is that they do not live in the same part of the nervous system. The legs were a physical adaptation that physical therapy can address. But the storm fear is what we call a conditioned fear response. It is stored in a different layer, and it does not respond to the same methods that fix the legs. It responds to repeated exposure in a safe context, to the accumulation of moments in which the feared stimulus occurs and the expected catastrophe does not. That process takes time, and it cannot be forced." Elena said, "How much time?" Vera said, "There is no honest answer to that." Elena said, "If I use pressure-based desensitization." Vera set down her pen. She said, "It would likely produce a horse that performs adequately in a storm by August." That is a true statement. It is also true that what you would be doing is training the animal to suppress the fear response rather than resolve it. The horse would look composed. It would not be composed. And over time, suppressed fear in horses tends to express itself in other ways, in unpredictable spooking, in a kind of flat effect that experienced horsemen recognize, and that your committee, if they are paying attention, will recognize too. Elena looked at the anatomy charts on the wall. She said, "And if I do not use those methods?" Vera said, "Then you are betting on something that cannot be scheduled." On the drive back, the sky over the valley was the particular blue of a Montana June evening that seems too large to be real, and the road went straight and empty through the grassland for miles. And Elena drove with both hands on the wheel and tried to locate the exact border between courage and foolishness. She could not find it. She had begun to suspect it did not exist as a line, but as a territory you moved through, and the only way to know which side you were on was to get to the end and look back. July brought 3 major storms. During each one, she was in the barn, in the corner of the stall, with the blanket and the lamp and the melody. The second storm lasted 5 hours. At some point during it, she fell asleep sitting up and woke to find Beacon's nose resting, very lightly, on her shoulder. She sat still for a long time in the gray pre-dawn, feeling the weight of it. She did not tell anyone about that. Some things are not improved by being said. The preliminary inspection session was scheduled for August 17th. On August 3rd, Elena received a formal letter from the County Agricultural Society informing her that due to a procedural update, participants in the preliminary session were required to demonstrate the animal's responsiveness to conditions that simulated the inspection environment, including outdoor movement in open ground and responsiveness to evaluator approach from multiple directions. In practice, what this meant was that the evaluators would be watching from outside, which meant Beacon would need to leave the barn. During a scheduled morning evaluation that, by the calendar, had a 73% statistical likelihood of occurring during a summer storm pattern that had already established itself across the valley. She read the letter 3 times. Then she went to the barn. Beacon was in the paddock. He had been going out reliably for 2 months now, in fair weather, with a confidence she found genuinely beautiful to watch. He moved with an ease that no longer looked like effort. The tendons had lengthened. The stride had opened. Dex had started saying, with his particular quietness, that the horse looked like something. She watched him for a long time. Then she went inside and sat at Emmett's desk and looked at the letter and thought about all of it. The deed, the clause, Kindle's folder, the developer's patience, the number that had seemed real in December and now felt like a threat wearing courtesy's clothing. She thought about what she would have to do to Beacon to guarantee the outcome. And then she thought about sitting in the straw at 3 in the morning with a lamp and a blanket and a melody that had no words, and an animal that had pressed its nose against her shoulder in the dark, and she understood that she had already made the decision. She had made it in February, in the auction pen, with her hand against his neck. She could not unmake it now. She would not. The price of that decision was real, and she accepted it, and the acceptance felt nothing like surrender. The morning of August 17th began before dawn with thunder. She heard it from the house at 4:30 and lay still for a moment with her eyes open in the dark, listening to the particular quality of it, whether it was moving through or settling in. It was settling in. She could feel it in the change of pressure against the windows, in the way the pines on the ridge went from their usual whisper to a heavier, lower sound. She dressed without turning on a light. She did not need one. When she got to the barn, Beacon was already awake. He stood in the middle of the stall, not pressed against the wall, not in the corner, just standing, facing the door, as if he had been waiting for her to arrive. His breathing was elevated. The white of his eye was there. But something was different from the early months, something she had begun to notice in the last few weeks that she had not yet allowed herself to name as progress. He was afraid, but he was not gone inside his fear. He was still here, watching the door, waiting. She came in. She sat in the corner. She lit the lamp. Outside, the storm built the way Montana storms build, not gradually, but in surges, each one heavier than the last. By 6 in the morning, the rain was coming in horizontal sheets across the yard, and the thunder was close enough that the intervals between strike and sound had collapsed to almost nothing. She could feel it in the ground through the straw. She hummed the melody. At 7, she heard a truck on the gravel road. Then another. The evaluators arriving through the storm, because the inspection calendar had no grace clauses for weather, and Kindle had made certain, she had learned from Clara the week before, that the preliminary session would proceed regardless of conditions. It was, he had argued to the committee, a legitimate test of an animal's working temperament. She heard voices in the yard. She heard Dex going out to meet them. She did not leave the stall. At 7:15, there was a knock on the barn door. Dex opened it and came in without looking at her directly, which told her something. He said, "They are set up in the east paddock. They are asking about the horse." She said, "Tell them he is being prepared." Dex said, "Elena, it is raining very hard." She said, "I know." He went back out. She sat. The storm pressed against the barn walls. Beacon shook. She kept humming. At 7:40, she heard a second set of footsteps on the barn floor and looked up to see Kindle in the doorway. He was in a rain jacket, hat dark with water, his expression composed in the way of someone who has been waiting a long time for a moment and is trying not to show how much they want it. He said, "Elena, the committee has been here 40 minutes. They cannot wait indefinitely." She said, "I know that." He said, "The horse is not going to perform." She said, "I know you believe that." He said, "This is not about belief. This is about a 6-month-old animal with a documented anxiety disorder and a recovery program that you have chosen to run on sentiment instead of science. I am sorry. I have tried to be patient. But if the committee certifies today that the horse is unable to perform, the clause in the deed becomes operative, and the Garfield County Agricultural Society will formally." She stood up. She did not do it to interrupt him, though it did interrupt him. She stood because Beacon had taken a step toward the stall door. Then another. His head was not at the height it would be one day, but it was higher than it had been. His legs were square and even. His breathing was still elevated, but the trembling had stopped. He was looking at the barn door. Kendall stopped talking. She walked to the stall door and opened it. Beacon stepped out of the stall and into the barn aisle. He stood for a moment, reading the sounds, the rain on the roof, the thunder rolling across the valley, the voices in the paddock beyond. His ears moved, cataloging. She walked to the barn door and opened it. The rain came in cold and immediate. The yard was running with water. The east paddock was visible through the gray curtain of the storm. 3 figures standing under a shared umbrella, and Dex standing nearby with his hat pulled low. She stepped out into the rain, and Beacon followed her. There was a moment, brief, suspended, in which nothing moved except the rain. The 3 evaluators stood in the paddock with their umbrella and their clipboards and their 12 decades of combined experience judging the quality of working horses in the state of Montana, and they watched a dark bay Colt walk out of a barn during a thunderstorm and cross the muddy yard toward them. He walked at Elena's shoulder. Not beside her exactly, but close. The kind of closeness that is voluntary, that an animal chooses not because it has been trained to stay in position, but because position, in that moment, is where it wants to be. His head was forward. Not high. Not yet, but forward. His stride was even. On the wet ground, in the rain, he placed each hoof with the unhurried precision of an animal that had relearned, step by step, what the ground felt like beneath it. One of the evaluators, a woman Elena recognized as Margaret Holt, who had been on this committee for longer than any of them, and who was known for a directness that some people called severity and that Elena had always privately respected, lowered her clipboard. Kendall was standing in the barn doorway behind them. Elena did not look back at him. Margaret Holt walked around Beacon slowly, clipboard at her side. She did not speak. She looked at the legs, at the carriage, at the way the colt responded to her approach, turning to watch her, not with fear, but with the alert attention of an animal that has decided people are worth examining rather than avoiding. She stood in front of him for a moment, rain running off the brim of her hat, and looked him in the eye. Then she looked at Elena. She said, "He is not what I expected." Elena said, "No." She said, "The storm does not appear to be a problem." Elena said, "It still is. He is choosing to be here anyway." Margaret Holt was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in her expression, not sentimentality, which was not in her vocabulary, but a kind of recalibration. The look of someone who has just been shown that a category they thought they understood has more room in it than they believed. The second evaluator, a man named Preston who specialized in heavy breed conformation, had walked to Beacon's left side and was moving his hands along the shoulder and neck with the focused attention of a practitioner at work. He looked up and said, without directing the remark to anyone in particular, "The muscle development here is unusual. Not what you would expect given the reported rehabilitation timeline. It is more," he paused. He said, "coherent, balanced." The third evaluator had not spoken. He was an older man named Wallace, who had been on the committee since before Elena moved to the ranch, and who was known to say very little and to mean most of it. He stood at a slight distance from the other two, watching not the horse but the interaction between the horse and Elena. He had been watching it since they walked out of the barn. Then, from the driveway, Kendall's voice, raised slightly above the rain. "I want to note for the record that this animal has a documented history of anxiety behaviors and was not able to complete the required preliminary evaluation on the scheduled date. There is a procedural question about whether this informal presentation can be counted as." Margaret Holt turned. She said, with the calm of someone who has terminated more arguments than she has started, "This is a preliminary session, not a formal record. The purpose is assessment, and we are assessing." She turned back to the horse. The rain continued. Beacon stood in it. Every few seconds, thunder rolled across the valley, and every time it did, his ears moved toward the sound, alert, registering, not collapsed into terror. The trembling was there, faint and deep, like a note beneath a chord. But he was standing. He was present. Elena stood beside him and felt the rain running down the back of her neck and thought, "This is enough. Whatever they decide, this is enough." He came out. Wallace spoke for the first time. He had been standing at the paddock fence with his arms folded, hat pulled down, and he had been looking at Beacon for a long time without expression. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular quietness of someone who has been deciding something and has finished deciding. He said, "Elena, where did you acquire this horse?" She told him. The clearance auction, the processing lot, the colt that had been standing alone with his head down in the rain. Wallace nodded. He said, "Pull his lower lip for me." It was an unusual request, not one that would have meaning to most observers. But Elena knew enough to understand that a horse's lower lip, in certain breeding lines, carries a tattoo mark placed in the first weeks of life by registrars who track genetic lineage for preservation purposes. Marks that most people never look for because most horses do not carry them. She stepped forward and gently lifted Beacon's lower lip. He allowed it, another thing he would not have allowed in February. There was a mark there. Wallace crossed the paddock and stood in front of the horse. He put on his glasses, wire-framed, the glasses of an old man who resents needing them, and looked at the tattoo for a long time. Then he looked at Beacon's profile, the line of the jaw, the set of the ear, the breadth across the forehead. He took off his glasses. He said, "His name when you bought him." She said, "He had no registered name. He was a processing lot. I renamed him Beacon." Wallace looked at her. Then he looked at the horse again. He said, as if speaking to himself as much as to anyone present, "His sire's sire's sire." There was a stallion, brought to this valley before the First War. A Percheron line, pure, not mixed, from the original French imports. Most people believe the line died out in the 40s when the last known holder of the lineage was sold out of state. He paused. He said, "The family never kept records. Nobody checked." He looked at Beacon. He said, "Nobody looked." Preston had come to stand beside him. He was looking at the tattoo, at the jaw, at the shoulder. He said, "You are saying this horse." Wallace said, "I am saying that whoever put that colt in a processing lot did not know what they had. And most people who passed him at that auction were looking for something with its head up." The rain came down. Beacon stood in it with his ears forward and his legs square on the wet ground. And the wind came off the mountain and moved through his mane. And for the first time since February, he lifted his head. Not all the way, not to the angle it would reach with more months and more work, but enough. Enough to see his jaw align against the gray sky, the length of his neck, the architecture of an animal that carried in its blood something the valley had believed was lost. Margaret Holt looked at her clipboard. Then she put it, deliberately, under her arm. She said, "I think we have seen what we needed to see." Elena did not speak. She put her hand flat against Beacon's neck, the same way she had in the auction pen 8 months ago, through the rail, in the rain, not knowing what she was holding. And she felt his warmth against her palm and the deep, steady rhythm of his breathing. She did not cry. That came later. Kendall did not accept the preliminary assessment quietly. Within 3 days of the August session, he had filed a formal protest with the County Agricultural Society, citing 3 specific objections. First, that the preliminary session had been conducted under non-standard conditions. Second, that the animal's documented anxiety history represented an ongoing liability that the committee had failed to formally evaluate. Third, and this was the one that mattered most, and that had an attorney's language in it, that any assessment of heritage lineage based on an informal visual and tattoo identification rather than formal genetic documentation was legally insufficient to confer breeding status under the association's charter. The third point was not wrong. Wallace's identification, however authoritative, was a professional opinion, not a certified genealogy report. Without that certification, Beacon could not be formally registered in the Heritage Breed Program. And without that registration, the ranch's status under the inspection criteria was ambiguous in precisely the way that Kendall's attorney had intended. The formal inspection was still 6 weeks away. A DNA genealogy panel, the kind that could establish bloodline heritage beyond legal challenge, took, according to the laboratory Vera referred her to, approximately 4 to 6 weeks. She submitted the samples on the day she received Kendall's protest. Clara called the evening after. She said, "He is trying to run out the clock. If the genetic results arrive after the inspection date, his attorney argues they cannot be admitted as evidence for this cycle's certification. He gets the deed clause activated and the review panel is convened before the results are in." Elena said, "I know." Clara said, "What are you going to do?" Elena said, "Wait." Clara was quiet. Then she said, "That is not a strategy." Elena said, "No, it is a position. There is a difference." She went back to the barn. She went back to the morning work and the evening work and the ground sessions with Beacon that were now less about therapy and more about exploration, testing what he could do, pushing gently at the edges of his willingness, finding out what kind of horse was emerging from everything they had been through. He was becoming something she had not predicted. Not simply a recovered animal, not simply a healthy horse, but a horse with a quality she did not have the technical vocabulary to name, but that Dex described, one afternoon in the flattest possible tone, as dignity. She decided that was the right word. The genetic results arrived on September 10th, 4 days before the formal inspection. She opened the envelope at Emmett's desk, under the same lamp she had used to read the deed, and she read the report twice. Then she called Vera, who called Wallace, who arrived at the ranch the following morning with his wire-framed glasses and a brevity of expression that she had come to understand was his version of intensity. The lineage was confirmed, documented, and certifiable. She hand-delivered a copy to the association office and a copy to Kendall's attorney. She did not add a cover letter. She did not need to. The formal inspection fell on a Thursday morning in mid-September, and the valley woke to rain. Not the torrential, theatrical weather of August, a steady, quiet rain, the kind that Montana produces in September as if apologizing for the dramatic summer. The mountains were invisible behind low cloud. The pines were dark and still. The creek was up. By 8 in the morning, there were more people at the Whistling Pines Ranch than had been there since Emmett's funeral. Elena had not invited anyone beyond the committee, but the community has its own gravitational logic, and word had moved through the valley the way it always does in places where distances between people are long and the information that travels them is consequently precious. Clara was there. Dex was there. A handful of ranchers she knew by name, and several she knew only by association. Margaret Holt and Preston and Wallace arrived together, formally, with their clipboards and their institutional gravity. Kendall was there too. He stood near his truck with his attorney beside him, a woman from Billings in a coat that was wrong for the weather, and he watched the proceedings with the composed neutrality of a man who has not yet decided whether to be concerned. Elena brought Beacon out of the barn at 8:15. She did not try to time it for drama. She did not prepare a presentation. She simply let him out the way she let him out every morning, from his stall, through the barn aisle, out the main door, into whatever weather the day had decided to be. The rain came down on both of them. Beacon shook his head once, water flying from his mane, and then settled. He walked beside her across the yard to the inspection paddock with his ears forward and his stride even and his head at a height that was, now, nearly correct. Not the head of the deflated animal in the auction pen. The head of a horse that had discovered, through some long internal negotiation that no one had witnessed except in its effects, that it was safe to look at the world directly. The committee watched. The ranch watched. The rain came down and nobody moved. Margaret Holt walked through the formal evaluation with the methodical thoroughness that was her professional identity, and Beacon permitted each element of it. The approach from different angles, the handling of the legs and hooves, the assessment of movement at walk and trot on the lead line, with an attention and a willingness that she noted without comment on the first pass and noted again, more slowly, on the second. When she was finished, she stood with Preston and Wallace for several minutes, in the rain, with their heads together. Elena stood at the edge of the paddock with Beacon beside her and did not try to read their faces, because she had made her decision in January and the outcome of it was the outcome of it. And she had accepted that before August, before July, before the first storm session in March, perhaps even before the auction, in some part of herself that had been waiting 23 years to be tested in exactly this way. Gerald Pauck, the committee chair, came forward with a form on a clipboard. He said, in the careful official voice of someone who is conscious of being witnessed, the County Agricultural Society has completed its formal inspection of the Whistling Pines Ranch Draft and Heavy Breed Program. Based on the evaluation of animals presented, the lineage documentation submitted to our office on September 10th, and the assessment of the rehabilitation program's standards and outcomes as observed over the course of this certification cycle. The committee finds the program in compliance with all applicable standards for heritage breed production and care. He handed her a form with a line for her signature. His pen, his face, as he gave it to her, was not the face of a bureaucrat completing a transaction. It was the face of a man who had watched this ranch for 20 years and was glad, in a way that surprised him, to be the one to say this particular thing. She signed. Behind her, someone began to applaud. She did not know who first, only that it spread, the way things spread in small communities when they have been restrained for a long time and finally have somewhere to go. She did not turn around. She stood in the rain with the pen in her hand and felt the weight of 14 months and the particular lightness that comes after. Kendall walked to his truck. His attorney followed. Neither of them said anything. Wallace came to stand beside her. He looked at Beacon for a moment. Then he said, with the economy of a man who believes that language is most powerful when used sparingly, your husband would have liked this horse. She looked at him. She said, I know. That was part of it. He nodded. He understood. He went back to his truck. She stood in the paddock with Beacon while the crowd dispersed slowly around her. The way crowds do when they have just witnessed something they will be describing for years and are not quite ready to stop being inside it. The rain continued. It would continue for most of the day. She did not mind. She had stopped minding rain sometime in the winter, in the straw, with a lamp burning and a melody filling the dark, in the good company of someone who was learning, as she was, that fear does not have to be the last word. Dex came to stand beside her eventually. He said nothing for a while. Then he said, what happens now? She looked at the ranch, at the barn, at the fences that needed painting, at the drainage problem on the north side that was still on the list, at the mountains invisible behind their clouds. She said, we keep working. He nodded. He said, yeah. They went back to work. The ranch did not return to what it had been before Emmett died. It became something different, something that did not have a name yet, that was still in the process of being made. An operation defined not by the size of its animals or the force of its methods, but by the quality of its attention, by what it was willing to wait for. Beacon went on to be formally registered in the Heritage Breed Program with a lineage that rewrote several assumptions about what bloodlines had survived in Montana. He was not a show horse, and Elena did not make him one. She kept him. She worked him, slowly, in the ways that suited his temperament. In the storms, she still went to the barn. Not because he could not manage them. He had grown, over the following seasons, into a horse that stood in rain and thunder with the equanimity of something that has decided the world is manageable. But because she had come to understand that the ritual was not only for him. It was for her, for Emmett, for the melody that had no words and did not need them. The value of a life is not determined by the scars of its beginning. The ranch had always known that. It had just needed someone to remember. If this story stayed with you, if something in Elena's choice to be patient when the world was demanding speed felt familiar, leave a comment below. Tell us where you are watching from. And tell us, have you ever chosen the slower, harder path because the faster one would have cost you something you were not willing to lose? There are people watching this right now who are standing at their own version of that auction pen, looking at something the world has written off, trying to decide whether to raise their hand. This story is for them. If you believe that patience is a form of courage, press like. It costs you nothing, and it tells us to keep telling stories like this one. Subscribe if you are new. We release new stories every week. Stories about ordinary people who made extraordinary choices, and about what those choices cost and what they returned. And if you know someone who is in the middle of something difficult, someone who is tired of being told that what they are caring for is not worth the effort, send them this. Sometimes the most important thing a person can hear is that someone else chose to wait, and it was enough. We will see you in the next story.